Hi, welcome. It's so nice to see this room oriented this way and to see so many faces. My name is Paige Johnston. I am Associate Director of Public Programs at the GSD. And I'm going to begin tonight, like we always do, with an acknowledgement. The Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and future, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. The school also recognizes the work of the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationships that led to the creation of this acknowledgement. A quick reminder that we have live captioning available for our online audience. To enable the captions, just click the CC box at the bottom of your live stream window. And a final event plug for the semester. Please join us tomorrow at 2 p.m. here in Piper Auditorium for a symposium marking the release of The State of Housing Design 2023, a new book that examines themes in housing design using 100 case examples from 100 recent US buildings. For more information about that event or to watch videos from past events from this semester and previous semesters, please visit the GSD's website. And now I invite Ali Malkawi to join us at the table and shift us into tonight's program.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Ali Malkawi, Professor of Architectural Technology and the founding director of the Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. It's truly my honor and pleasure to see you all for the opening of this exhibition here until December 21st. And for our event, our Artificial Nature Perspectives on Design for an Era of Environmental Change. Now, nearly 10 years into an interdisciplinary research, we at the center are so grateful for this opportunity to showcase, share, and celebrate the timely work of our talented team of faculty and researchers. Before the program gets underway, we extend heartfelt thanks to Elizabeth Christoforetti, Assistant Professor in Practice of Architecture, who has masterfully curated this exhibition and brought our faculty's work to the fore. It was her vision, curation, and expertise that made this exhibition possible. We would like to thank the Graduate School of Design exhibition team and our center's faculty, including our panelists this evening, whose work forms the core of this exhibition. Collectively, they represent the future of leading-edge design research. And of course, no list of supporters would be complete without recognizing Dean Whiting and her staff. We are grateful for this opportunity and that would allow us to highlight the center's research. Finally, Carson Chan, curator of the exciting MoMA exhibit, Emerging Ecologies, thank you for joining us tonight on our panel. As we embark on the 10th year anniversary of the Center for Green Buildings and Cities, we are engaging in a crucial moment of reflection, both a celebration of the groundbreaking work that we have conducted to date and a recognition of what is yet to be done in response to an environmentally fragile planet. At inception, we sought to increase the focus on science and environment. We began by laying the groundwork for the center, establishing incubators of innovative ideas, and building a physical entity that would serve as both an ongoing demonstration project and a living laboratory for our short and long-term research. It has been an amazing journey. Our living laboratory, House Zero, now functions as an example of how our campus can effectively serve as a pilot platform to prove possible scalable solutions through long-term peer-reviewed research. Because the built environment is one of the main contributors to climate change, our faculty research promises to have profound impacts on the mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. Since 2014, the mission of the Center for Green Buildings and Cities has been unwavering: to transform the building industry through a commitment to design-centric strategy that directly links research outcomes to the development of new processes, systems, and products. Data and computation are at the center of our research mission as we enhance and rethink the ways we design our built environments. Our researchers and faculty from the fields of architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, and other disciplines focus on many facets of the built environment, from material research at the nanoscale to sustainable innovations at the building and city scales. This exhibition serves as a window into the depth and breadth of their research in response to today's environmental challenges. Our research also informs and advances the school's educational mission, incorporating direct research, classroom experience, and design studios to create a new generation of designers. As we highlight the work of our center and the Graduate School of Design, we are also focused on how best to translate this research into practice, faced with increasingly urgent environmental imperatives. In tonight's discussion, our panelists address some of these questions, weighing what the exhibition cast as an era of environmental change. Tonight, you will hear a candid dialogue that focuses on both current and future research, as well as the history of design for environmental change. I'm joined by Elizabeth Christoforetti, Carson Chan, Grace Law, and Antoine Picon from Paris, who will be engaging in this discussion. Thank you all for being tonight here in this celebration and recognition of the exhibition, the Center for Green Buildings and Cities, and the Harvard Graduate School of Design. I would like now to introduce Elizabeth Christoforetti, Assistant Professor in Practice of Architecture and the curator of this exhibition.
Ali, thank you very much, first of all, for the collaboration throughout the design and curation of this exhibition, and for trusting me with this remarkable body of work from the Harvard Center for Green Buildings and Cities. To Dean Sarah Whiting and Professor Martin Bechtold for the prompt to engage this work and to frame our collective research within the field and in relationship to the urgent environmental imperatives of our time. And thanks also to the faculty and all of the talented people who are behind the production of the exhibition and the event tonight. And a double thank you, actually, to the faculty. I want to just underscore that, whose research is featured for all of the collaboration over the past weeks and months. It's a rare and special opportunity to have a view into the things that the people are quietly clicking away at behind doors in this building, and they're remarkable. So much of the work going on in the exhibition is still in progress, and it's something like a sketch, which I find also to be quite special in terms of what we get to see. And the rigor and insights are to be admired. So in terms of format, for the next 15 minutes, I'll provide a reflection on the research showcased in the exhibition outside. I'll then have the pleasure of introducing Carson Chan, curator of Emerging Ecologies, Architecture, and the Rise of Environmentalism at the Museum of Modern Art, and a 2005 alumnus of the GSD. Carson will provide his own reflection on the work of his current and remarkable show at the MoMA, and as well as his broader scholarship on the topic. We will conclude, as Ali mentioned, with a conversation between Professors Grace Law and Antoine Picon. All right, so with that, Oh, this was what I was going to put up when I was thanking everyone. There are a lot of people who were involved in this, FYI, and they've all done an amazing job, and I'm very grateful, as you now know. All right, so the exhibition on display outside in Gun Gallery is not only a window into the inner workings of faculty research, but also into the ways that design can and must act in the world to confront climate change, given the technological capacities and triggering conditions of our moment. This area of study in cultural production responds to the confluence of climate change, social justice, emerging technology, and the data that drives it, including the current wave of purposeful artificial intelligence. The collective body of work reveals something very clear about not only the relationship of design to environmental change, but also about the changing condition of design itself. The title of the exhibition has two meanings. It is a reference to the current context for design, and I'll cover this in a moment, but also to the role that designers play in society and in practice beyond the doors of this institution. We are the creators of the artificial. This is literally all that we do. We make and imagine the future, we channel the kind of world that we want to inhabit, and we create the artificial, the physical stuff of our built environment that is the meaningful context for our human lives together in society. This capacity to imagine and grow our world is both the cause of our escalating environmental plight and the means by which we might confront it. Our artificial nature, the name, is also our context for design, the second meaning. It's our surroundings in a very basic way. In the face of overwhelming waste and an economic paradigm that drives us towards more and bigger design production and the carbon emissions that come with it, our relationship with our surroundings is shifting. Our understanding of nature as a bucolic landscape to be either dominated or restored by means of human invention is no longer functional as a platform for design. Instead, there's a growing awareness of our context as something else, as an entangled system of biological, cultural, and technological relationships in which we play some part. Our ecological, material, and digital world is now a synthetic confluence of human and non-human. And we can think of non-human systems in this case as both biological and machine. The context of, or condition of our world, framed in this way, shifts the role of design from something like a first responder or a crisis manager or maybe even hero or villain in the climate crisis to something other and more collaborative in the imagination of a shared and hybrid world. The scene for this design research is an environment that is no longer binary between human and nature, but one that is deeply hybrid and fused. Between natural and artificial, human and not human, data and design, digital, physical, and scalable systems in local relevance. This condition liberates design research and practice to see our world through the lens of previously invisible data and systems, to operate in new ways and with new human and non-human companions, to imagine altogether different kinds of design output. A significant category of research funded by the Center for Green Buildings and Cities explores modes of re-seeing or analyzing our world within this new paradigm. This form of design research utilizes large data and small data to visualize otherwise unseen conditions, daylight systemic values, and advocate for changes in standards, policies, and the mechanics that shape our environment. Here, Peters Rowe's research team constructs a comparative view of urban metabolism across settlement types to understand the temporal distributions of material, energy, and water. The method ultimately makes visible environmental aspects such as embodied energy and carbon so that future action can be taken to improve material, water, energy, and waste management. The research in the exhibition builds upon the work of our significant predecessors who utilized mapping and geospatial data to see the environment in new and more systemic ways. And I know Carson will speak a little bit about the history here at the GSD. Ian McHarg's method for spatial analysis, here on the left, layers environmental data such as soil, water, and topography to obtain a more robust understanding of a given condition. Faculty research by Craig Douglas, Rose Monacella, and Malkit Soshan builds upon this logic by layering historically marginalized dimensions of the social and cultural landscape. They imagine a process, in addition to analysis, to yield actionable and repeatable awareness of the layered impact that infrastructural change will yield in a transition to renewable energy production. The research questions and makes visible the actors and agencies involved, forms of governance, territorial demarcations, land use, ecosystems, historical events, material flows, and processes that determine the shape of the ever-evolving form of energy production. Making visible and re-seeing our conditions as an entangled set of social, biological, and technological relationships then sets up a platform for design in relationship to them. So what do we design next? A kind of design that is networked and integrally linked to these systems, that is continuously changing in relationship to feedback loops between design and environmental conditions. This research by the team of Pablo Perez Ramos uses thermal analysis to reveal the oasis as something of an ancient technology that continues to sustain agricultural practices in conditions of extreme aridity. So places where people live that are extremely dry, like deserts, for instance. This mode of seeing a slowly but continuously changing and evolving form of design, in this case a continuously modulated relationship between human inhabitants, the landscape, and the climate over centuries of change, points to a set of fundamental design strategies that may be replicated or modeled in other conditions with the goal of both climatic resilience and meaningful human life. Neil Kirkwood's exploration of mangrove deployment to mitigate extreme floods and increasingly unstable climatic conditions is another example of active collaboration with biological partners, in this case, a community of mangroves. Design merges manufactured and natural landscapes of Thailand, operating as a process for ongoing care between local culture, plant ecology, and an increasingly resilient coastline. And a very different kind of design. The laboratory for the Center for Green Buildings and Cities, which is housed in House Zero, is a very different form of continuously changing design. The building, an adaptive reuse of a decades-old residential building just across the street from where we're sitting right now, is networked to receive continuous flows of information from the internet, things like weather data, as well as an interior sensor network. Artificial intelligence is employed to optimize building performance for human occupation and to enable a dramatically lower carbon footprint. Such relationships with non-human intelligence, from mangrove to machine, provide clear and effective responses to environmental risk and carbon production. But these processes and systems do create some tension, for architecture is both a discipline and a practice. The essential DNA of the House Zero library, for instance, is both physical and digital, a networked architecture of data as much as it is a physical space. This hybridity between human and machine meaning is explored in a collaboration between Professors Grace Law and Erica Naginski and their joint studio and seminar entitled Eco-Folly. Their students explore the historic tension in architecture between form, substance, and technology, between design imagination and technical processes, in an effort to speculate on the form of sustainability. The seminar reveals that this tension has not just emerged with the rapid advances in artificial intelligence that we've seen over the past months and years. We see here a 17th century example of design both hiding and revealing its machine DNA. And this uncomfortable hybridity is likely to persist at an increased intensity that warrants certainly further investigation. Eco-Folly design, the work that came out of the studio, looks to foundational principles of earth science and environmental data and yields an array of projects characterized by process-based transformations over time. This is a kind of transformative and locally responsive architecture that is both slow-moving and unstable by design. One ongoing outcome of the studio is work by student Leonard Palmer, which explores an architecture defined by low energy and evaporative heating and cooling systems. The studio project has recently found a home in the Center for Green Building and Cities faculty member Jonathan Grinham's lab, and is the source of ongoing architectural technology research designed to transform the processes by which architecture can act in the face of climate change. I have learned that all of this work that's in the exhibition, which, as I mentioned, is much of it's in progress, goes on to have many tentacles and lives after it gets funded initially, and that's fairly remarkable. I'd like to note one last observation on the disposition of our current mode of design research. Architecture operating at the intersection of design imagination, technology, and social change looks very different now than it did in the middle of the 20th century. I wish I had a more eloquent analysis for what I'm about to say, but I know that Carson will be discussing some of Buckminster Fuller's work, and this collaborative work of Buckminster Fuller and June Jordan, which is featured out in our exhibition outside, feels very notable within the context of both exhibitions, and I hope it will be a point of discussion later. The project merges Jordan's anti-racist activism in the wake of the 1964 Harlem riots with Fuller's concepts for affordable and environmentally sustainable housing. It's characterized by heroic form and major physical transformations of infrastructure, a sort of like a firefighting fire criticism of the urban renewal era values that drove massive demolition and displacement through eminent domain. June Jordan writes in a particularly enduring and prescient passage, "There is no evading architecture, no meaningful denial of our position. You can build to defend the endurance of man, to protect his existence, to illuminate it. But you cannot build for these purposes merely in a spasmodic response to past and present crises, for then crises, like the poor, will always be with us." This remarkable but little-known 1965 work, published in Esquire of all places, stands in stark contrast to the significantly less heroic work on sustainable and affordable housing within our exhibition, which operates by filling in gaps and quietly co-opting invisible infrastructures of capital and data to provide a bottom-up mechanism for change. The mode by which architecture is currently empowered to act is something maybe more akin to a radical pragmatism, something that may be more quiet and more vast by linking into integral networks of systems and networks. Finally, a closing statement before I introduce Carson on the potential of design research and impact in relationship to the imperatives of climate change. The faculty research is incredibly diverse, and I will flip to this slide, in terms of discipline and scale. So you can see on the x-axis above, the small stuff is on the left and the big stuff is on the right. So people coming from architecture, urbanism, landscape, and doing work across scales. When we add a y-axis and plot the work in relationship to its capacity to scale or replicate, so that's to operate within a system, to transfer knowledge across or between contexts, or because the work itself is a process rather than an artifact or tangible form, a picture of the structural potentials of design in relationship to environmental change emerge. The research demonstrates an ambition for both contextual sensitivity and scalable environmental impact. This opens up a set of questions for future design practice and research, and I'll put a few questions out there and we'll ask some more later. What value systems drive architecture and design of the built environment today, and how do we determine those and be clear about what they are? For example, what is our position on the paradigm of infinite growth in a finite world? Must we build less? And if so, how will the business of design survive? What is the nature of an architecture that is hybrid, collaborative, and continuously changing over the course of its life cycle in response to the imperatives of climate change and energy rejection? Who's responsible for it? Who's actually designing it? How do we think about that? This is an exciting and important moment to look both inside and outside of the discipline and to reflect upon history as a platform for a very different area of design, of environmental change through design. So, with that prompt to history, I will introduce Carson Chan, inaugural, I think that sounds sort of right, director of the Emilio Ambas Institute for the Joint Setter of the Built and Natural Environment, and a curator in the museum's Department of Architecture and Design. He develops, leads, and implements the Ambas Institute's manifold research initiatives through a range of programs, including exhibitions, public lectures, conferences, seminars, and publications. He holds a Bachelor of Architecture degree from Cornell University and a Master of Design Studies from our own GSD. His doctoral research at Princeton University tracks the architecture of public aquariums in post-war United States against the rise of environmentalism as a social and intellectual movement. He is the founding editor of Concurrent, Collective for Architecture, History, and Environment, an online publishing and research platform that foregrounds the environment in the study of architectural history. So it is an honor to have Carson's perspective on architecture's evolving response to the environmental crisis. And Carson, please come and join me.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I see many friends in the audience, some from when I was a student here at the GSD 20 years ago. I'm deeply grateful to Paige, Ali, and Elizabeth for the kind invitation to join in the celebration of the opening of our artificial nature and of the incredible work of the Center for Green Building and Cities. I can only hope that after 10 years of the Ambas Institute, we can claim such riches as we see in the lobby here today. So what is the Emilio Ambas Institute for the Joint Study of the Built and Natural Environment? We don't have an acronym, so I'll just have to repeat it the whole time like that. It started 2.5 years ago with a gift from Emilio Ambas, who was a curator at MoMA in the 60s and 70s. And it's a platform that aims to foster, support and produce new research on the fraught relationship between the built and natural environment, or architecture and nature. So I know these terms, built and natural, architecture and nature, are all contested terms, and so maybe we can define them later on in our discussion. Since we've started, we've organized many programs that you mentioned already, aimed to address the many different audiences of MoMA. We've done a discussion series with university students called Material Worlds that we collaborated with Columbia University on. So every episode of the series is focused on a different building material. We've done a series of YouTube videos called Built Ecologies that focuses, each episode is on a different architect or designer that has environmental and ecological issues at the forefront of their practice. James Wines was our first episode, for example. We've done something called, not public facing, but it's called Architecture Studio in the Anthropocene. So this is a summit that we do once a year that includes, where we invite every architecture school in the US and Canada to join in a conversation about why the climate crisis needs to be addressed, or environmental and ecological issues need to be addressed in every studio going forwards. We do a lot of work with children. And this is something that I didn't think I was going to be doing when I first started working at MoMA, but as I was telling Elizabeth, as I was conceiving of the Ambas Institute, I realized that if I was going to be focusing on the climate crisis, it's really the 6-year-olds I really need to do the research with. So we've been transforming a lot of the research we've been doing, things that we've been exhibiting, things we've been acquiring, transforming all that into activities for children that we've been distributing to schools, more than 5,000 schools now throughout the New York area. And this year we hosted 2 academic conferences, one in Iceland, in Reykjavik, where we had more than 50 scholars from around the world discuss the history of environmental architecture, and one last week in collaboration with Princeton University. So tonight I was asked to give a short introduction, a kind of walkthrough of the Institute's first exhibition at MoMA. In many ways, it can be seen as a kind of prehistory to some of the cutting-edge research that we see in Elizabeth's exhibition. Oh, this was a slide I was going to show first. So Emerging Ecologies is a survey of how American architecture responded to the rise of environmentalism in the 60s and 70s. The exhibition starts in the 1930s with Falling Water. Frank was right. I think you see that model in the back over there. And then it ends with Emilio Ambas, James Wines in the mid-90s, or when architecture, the relationship between architecture and environment was codified, let's say, by the advent of LEED certification. The aim is to bring out instances where architecture addressed environmental and ecological concerns, one thing is to highlight practices that haven't been given the attention that should have before, including practitioners like Glenn Small, Eugene Sway, Carolyn Dry. Something else we do in the exhibition is to show the work of well-known practices, but there are less-known projects that have focused on environmental issues, so like the Eames office, for example. This period between the 30s and 90s coincides with modern architecture, of course, something we know very well at MoMA. And so we conceived of the show as a kind of gathering of the work the work in the show is a kind of, the idea was to constitute it as a kind of alternate history to modern architecture, a kind of counter-movement or anti-movement to modern architecture that we call environmental architecture. So, in many ways, you know, the way we tell the story of architecture, the canonical way, you know, or the traditional way we've been telling it, doesn't really allow us to address things like the climate crisis or environmental justice or other kind of issues. So the idea is by creating a new framework altogether, we can start to address these issues. Something else we want to do at the Ambas Institute more broadly, beyond the exhibition, is indeed to redefine the definition of architecture for the general public. By and large, when the general public thinks about architecture, they think about buildings. So architecture as object, or architecture as building design. What we want to do is to change that definition to architecture as process. So that means everything from resource extraction to the labor connected to that extraction, to the social, political, economic, racial context of buildings, to the afterlives of buildings. What do we do when we're done with our buildings? Do we dismantle them for parts? Do we demolish them and put them in landfills? So from extraction to afterlife, all that is architecture, and the building, in fact, is just one moment within that process. So by transforming that definition, redefining it, we can have the public join us in discussing architecture in more broader ways, but also in ways that will allow us to address these urgent questions of climate. So before I take you through the show, a few things that we want to do in the exhibition is to address, to expand the definition of architecture. So this is what we see in front of us here is documentation from the so-called Orm Dam protests from September 1981. And so there was a plan in the last century, a federal plan, to build a dam just east of Phoenix, Arizona, at the confluence of Salt and Verde rivers. And this dam would have helped with the water management of Phoenix. It would have prevented floods that happened sporadically, and it would have helped with the irrigation of the farmland around Phoenix as well. But it also would have flooded, as you can see from the map on the left, 2/3 of the Yavapai Nation's land. And so they protested. There's only about 300 or so members of the Yavapai Nation. But they protested, they went on the radio, they spoke to the newspapers, they reenacted the Trail of Tears, in fact. And so eventually they got the dam canceled. And it was interesting and important for us to put this in the exhibition because it allows us to talk about architecture in this expanded way that I just mentioned. It allows us to talk about how preventing a structure from being built is as architectural as building a structure. Preventing something from being built can change the built environment as much as building something. So this kind of reshapes the way we define architecture, not only for the general public, but I think also as a kind of community of academics as well. Something else we want to do in the exhibition is to re-narrate familiar objects through environment and ecology. So here is Fuller's Dymaxion dwelling machine from 1944 to 46. And it's part of our collection at MoMA. And it's often talked about as a easily deployable, inexpensive, post-war prefab housing solution. And so Fuller wanted these kind of dome, yurt-looking houses to be the face of the suburbs, basically. But we have it in the exhibition because we want to kind of bring out the almost passive house dimensions of the design. Fuller thought of how these, in different climates, these houses can retain heat, how they can cool themselves. There's a kind of gray water retention system that allows for water recycling. So in many parts of the exhibition, by re-narrating familiar objects, we can then include them into what we're calling environmental architecture. And as in this exhibition, as in our artificial nature, What we want to do in Emerging Ecologies is to celebrate architects and designers who haven't been celebrated adequately, in our opinion, in the past. And so this is the work of Eleanor Raymond and Maria Telkes, the Dover Sun House from 1948, which is also in this exhibition. It's incredible for many reasons. One, it's a very early example of a solar thermal energy storage technology. And two, it was designed by two women in 1948. At the height of her career, Maria Telkes, the engineer on the left over there, was, in the popular press, she was called the Sun Queen. And this technology that she developed was seen as more impactful even than the atomic bomb. And of course, her career was cut short by male colleagues at MIT. And so to include this work, not yet this, but to include this work in the introductory section of the exhibition alongside Frank Lloyd Wright, alongside Buckminster Fuller, gives us great pleasure. This didn't make it into the exhibition, but it's in the book, which I think the library will soon get a copy of. But this is the course plan, Serge Chermayev's course plan for environmental design class that he taught here at GSD from 1953 onwards. It was taught, I think, until the mid-'80s, last time I checked. So what's interesting about this course was that every single student going through GSD, whether you're in planning, architecture, or landscape, had to take this course. And in the first 10 years or so, every of them had to take them with Serge Chermayev. So this is a fun thing that we didn't end up putting in the exhibition. We thought that our general public might not appreciate it as much as I did, but it's in the book. And yeah, this is the introductory section of the exhibition. The exhibition is organized in 5 sections. This section is called Enclosed Ecologies. And it's a kind of deep dive into, let's say, the architectural urge to enclose entire ecosystems and to control nature, let's say. It's a section that really looks at the moment when architects had a trust in technology, where technology can fix all sorts of different things. And this quote that's in the show outside, the Cedric Price quote from 1966, technology is the answer, but what is the question, kind of typifies the work in this exhibition. We have on the top left and also on the right, examples from NASA. In the 1970s, the anxieties about environment had to do with resource depletion, overpopulation, environmental degradation. And if the folks at NASA thought that if we were going to be destroying the planet, let's build another one somewhere else. And so we were really excited to be able to show these original paintings from the conference they did in 1975, where they invited architects, designers, astrophysicists, including Gerard O'Neill, who came up with this idea of the Stanford torus, a large rotating donut shape that produces its own artificial gravity. Here you can see California reproduced inside the structure in outer space. This is another from Cambridge 7 architect, so another GSD alumnus, Peter Chermayev. And this is a project that Cambridge 7 did in the 90s. It's a rainforest inside a dome in Osaka that was never built. But again, it shows this idea of the control of nature. The next section of the exhibition is called Life Forms, so it looks at architecture beyond the human realm. One of the kind of highlights, I guess, for us was to look at the work of Glenn Small, who you see on the top right over there, an architect that we didn't know about before the research of the exhibition, and who were really excited to show the work of. He was one of the founders of SCI-Arc. And in a way, he kind of, let's say, departed from SciArc because his work was more environmental, more ecological, less formal. And the bottom, we have the work of Ant Farm, architects also from the West Coast, who were inspired by the work of John C. Lilly, neuroscientists, and they thought that, according to Lilly's research, if dolphins and humans were the most intelligent species on the planet, then we should be working together. So this is their idea for a dolphin embassy, a building in the middle of the ocean where humans and dolphins can work together. The next section is called Environment as Information. And it looks at a moment when architects realized that if we're going to be looking at environmental and ecological issues, then the traditional tools we have with us, line drawings, paper models, wasn't going to cut it anymore. The work on the left, which Elizabeth showed part of as well, this is from Ian McHarg's studio at UPenn from the late 60s. And he asked students, he was one of the first professors to ask architecture students to consider large swaths of land. And so this is the drawings of the Delaware River Basin. He asked students to draw out the water conditions, the vegetation, the geological conditions, in short, to draw out the entire ecosystem, to map out the ecosystem, to produce the ecological knowledge of this land. And it's important for us to, in this exhibition, to show this work too, because the Delaware River Basin is the ancestral homeland of the Lenape people. And so it reminds us that, in fact, ecological knowledge wasn't produced in the 60s and 70s at Ivy League universities, but it's been developed by generations of people who we could have inherited this knowledge from if they weren't displaced or killed to begin with. So these drawings remind us that the 60s and 70s were this moment of innovation in architecture and environment, but also a moment of recovery, of knowledge recovery. This is the work also from GSD. This is from the studio of Howard T. Fisher, and this is the kind of really beginning moments of computer graphics. This is from the Laboratory for Computer Graphics, I think that's what it's called. This is called the SciMap system, which is this incredible innovation by Fisher, and it's the progenitor of our GIS systems today. Where am I? Let's see. Yeah, this is, so there's two wall-sized displays in the exhibition. One of them is this work by Buckminster Fuller, perhaps one of his least known works, called World Game, but something that he's worked on for a long time, from the mid-60s until his passing. It was basically Fuller's idea of how architecture and architects in specific can save the world. And by how we do that is by projecting different information, different phenomena, different movement of resources on his world map, the Dymaxion map, and by having an overview of all these different phenomena and movements. So this is the movement of bread grain that he mapped out. Then we can prevent things like famines. We can prevent things like food shortage, resource depletion. Of course, things didn't exactly work out that way for architecture. The other large wall-scale display we have is images from the so-called Warren County protests. And so we wanted to look at how, we look at things on the, let's say, the solar system scale, on the global scale, but when these questions of environmental pollution, degradation come to the ground, how are they manifested? And so it has been federal policy, in fact, to find locations to dump toxins like PCBs. And the EPA, for example, for several years, thought that brown and black communities were the places where PCBs should be dumped. And so in the early 80s, the residents from Warren County, Afton, North Carolina, had enough, and they thought that they were getting sick, they were dying, and so they protested. They connected with members of the civil rights movement, and they protested. So what's interesting about this protest, unlike the Orm Dam protest, is that it didn't work. The government continued to dump PCBs in this community. In fact, they sprayed it on. But what it did do was it galvanized a community to really change legislation, to change zoning laws, to change the way we handle toxic chemicals. And in the way that it's really changed the built environment, this movement, this protest, let's say, that's why we included in the architecture exhibition. I'll just go quickly through these last two sections. This is called Critical Experiments, and it looks at architecture practices that largely were skeptical of popular culture or skeptical of popular culture and thought that it was mass society, in fact, that was to blame for a lot of our ecological problems. And finally, the last section of the exhibition is called Green Poetics. It's looking at architects that were more interested in how buildings and their designs behaved in our imagination, let's say, and less in how they behaved energy-wise. So of course we have Emilio Ambas in this part of the exhibition, who besides being the funder of my institute, was also the leading voice of green architecture in the 90s. Top right, we have James Wines, who, in this almost MoMA icon, this house of high-rise of homes, just by putting together two typologies, the single-family house, the suburban type, and the high-rise, the urban type, he asked us many questions about how we should live. So creating this whimsical hybrid, he asked us, how do we live? How should we live? How can we live? And the book that I had mentioned before, so in many ways, this idea of environmental architecture, this counter movement to modern architecture, the idea is not for a moment to be the kind of, the voice of authority, let's say, on how this movement is kind of shaped. So instead of a catalog, we really call this book a field guide. So the projects in the book are not listed, are not put into groups as they are in the exhibition, but they're put in alphabetical order. And the idea is that there's, after a brief introductory essay from me, the works are just put in a kind of document that just so you can see the works in the exhibition, but in alphabetical order, so not in any kind of editorialized way. And it ends with a timeline. We have several collaborators who worked with us on this timeline of American environmental history, and the aim is that we can continue this movement, continue this conversation that we leave off in the mid-90s. And I think that's it. Thank you.
So for those of you who haven't seen the exhibition, Carson's show, Emerging Ecologies, it's really remarkable. There's, he had this sort of genius idea of taking that timeline that he just showed and spreading it out across that very, very long wall where you come out of the elevators, and you can just immediately understand the arc and the trajectory of the way that this work has evolved. We have also asked Professors Antoine Picon and Grace Law to join us for this conversation. And so Grace, I hope you will come up and join us here at the table. Grace Law is Professor of Architecture and Chair of the Department of Architecture. She's also Principal of Law Dahlman Architects, internationally recognized for the integration of architecture, engineering, and landscape. Grace is the former chair of the practice platform here at the school and the founder and host of the podcast Talking Practice. She's deeply devoted to matters of architectural pedagogy and practice, so how design moves between disciplinary boundaries and into the world. And both she and Antoine, who I will introduce next, have work in the current exhibition and valuable perspectives on the role of design in the built environment in relationship to the urgent environmental imperatives of our time. Antoine is joining from Paris, so we are particularly grateful for him, and it's very late in Paris. Antoine is the G. Ware Travelstead Professor of the History of Architecture and Technology and Director of Doctoral Programs here at the GSD. He works on the history of architectural and urban technologies and is currently writing on urban natures, technology, and politics, the relationship between city and nature. So Antoine, maybe direct the first question to you. As a way of entering into the conversation, I wonder if you would provide us with a bit of perspective on how our relationship with our surroundings, which we have been calling the environment, has evolved over the past centuries of urban growth. Carson showed us the 20th century explosion of design in the response to the environmental crisis, but of course you are a trove of information about a much bigger framing.
You're muted.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm not sure I can add actually a lot to, your very thoughtful initial statement. I think, I think the title Artificial Nature summarizes probably the most important evolution. We thought for a very long time that we were actually designing in nature, but things which were separated from it. And now we are actually confronted with a kind of seamless connection between what we do, what we design, and what is out there. And to the point that they are, as the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk noted once, the very notion of an exterior is now challenged. So we have to design and to use also Buckminster Fuller, a famous metaphor, we have to design within spaceship Earth. So that's probably the biggest change in many respects. So with, of course, new questions, should we build always? A lot of other questions like that. So, but I think you say pretty much, the most important thing in your presentations.
Good to hear. Grace, do you have some thoughts on this?
Well, it's interesting because, first of all, thank you so much. And this is just a remarkable just capturing of all the work that's going on at both institutions. And it's just incredibly interesting how coincidental the timing of these two exhibits. That says a lot, actually, about where we are and how everyone is thinking about this. So I think that's really quite amazing. Elizabeth sent me these questions because she's
so organized.
She's so organized, and she wants us to do our homework. So I did have a kind of interesting thought about this. I was contemplating her diagram, the diagram that she showed.
My XY axis.
The XY axis, yeah. Which goes from small to big on the X axis and from one-off to scalable on the Y axis. And all the projects are here, but Erica Naginsi and I have our project down here. So we were wondering, should we, anyway, so I thought about this a little bit. I thought, well, I need to take issue with that, because even Jonathan, our security guard at the Donut, said, did you know that you're down there in the corner by yourself? So I said, okay, we got to address this issue. And I thought to myself, well, we're in this very interesting moment, because what I learned from Ecofolly, and I want to again thank Ali Malkawi and the Center for Green Buildings for funding us. So Erica and I worked together, and of course Erica is a historian. And what we realized was that students at this moment in time, as maybe they're in their mid-20s perhaps, and by the time they're reaching grad school, that they are quite far removed from the question of first principles in science. Maybe the last time they looked at it was in their earth science class in, 8th grade. So this really surprised me, because some very fundamental questions of first principles, for example, hot air rises, water runs downhill, how the planetary water cycle works, prevailing winds, these kinds of the questions of how condensation occurs. It was fascinating, because I wasn't expecting that there was a kind of gap in knowledge there, and I don't know where it occurred, but because I know that curriculum is taught in 8th grade, having had 8th graders. But then I thought what was interesting about this was that what we realized was that when students explored this very essential set of first principles, for them, of course, they cited it in a very particular spot on the Crane Estate because they were testing it there. But in fact, these are wildly scalable because they don't have major cost. These are actually these are principles that we need to leverage that are available to us, that are part of our natural systems, and that they're wildly replicable because these properties are intrinsic in the natural world. And many of the technologies that we were studying are actually ancient in their origins. So, for example, Leonard Palmer's pipe cycle, which you showed, which I thought was really interesting, it leverages pre-existing kind of ideas about water and plumbing infrastructure, which informs a much more nuanced idea about microclimates that expand the definition of comfort. Una Davis, her project out there, is really a meditation on wind turbines that have been used for more than 1,000 years and that we find in Iran. And Chelsea Janot Baptiste deploys concepts of heliotropism, which follow the sun, and Naistenazi, which are the opening and closing of petals of flowers due to diurnal shifts, to think about how we deal with solar panels. So it was a very interesting moment, and I would like to say that in that context, we called upon Holly to help us. We called upon Jonathan. So it was a course, a studio and seminar that actually also very, very deeply engaged our technology faculty partners. And so it's, part of your line of questioning had to do with the question of pedagogy, and that was super interesting because that was a moment that it was one of the most richest experiences of my academic career.
I mean, this question of ancient technology makes me think of someone that in the exhibition, Ralph Knowles, who I learned from a colleague here. He said that, through looking at environment, modern architecture can then start to approach the sophistication of indigenous knowledge. So I think, this idea of how to rethink about how we think about progress, or redefine things like progress, is kind of key to all of these questions we're talking about. Something maybe in terms of pedagogy, I also want to ask, because I think something that the Center for Green Building and Cities has been doing already is to compel different ways of teaching, expanding the kind of topics that people are teaching about. But I'm wondering if we can also, in the face of the climate crisis, change our methods and expand our methods of how we teach architecture. And I'm thinking specifically about, how we define, for example, I'm thinking about how in architecture school, students are asked to design, let's say, public space for the public good. But oftentimes we never really interrogate how we define the word public or how we define the word good. And I think when we get to questions of environment and designing for a change environment, I think to really sit down and define what we mean by good, might be necessary. In fact, there are entire disciplines like ethics, that define words like good and bad. So I wonder if this is something that you see, changing in architecture education, in which we don't leave it up to chance how students define what the good or bad questions of ethics are, but something that we start to have as classes. I think, in my knowledge, very few architecture schools have engaged. I think Cambridge in the UK had an ethics and architecture class. I think there was another school in New Zealand I found, but by and large, there isn't one unless I'm wrong.
It's really interesting. Antoine and I happened to be involved in a conversation in the MARC II Pro seminar a couple of weeks ago, and I know Antoine, you had brought up this issue of values, which I think is also related to this. So I don't know if there's something there.
I think it's a complicated issue because at the same time, it would be dangerous if it was only up to the designer to decide what is the common good, etc. I agree that ethics is definitely, but we're having, by the way, I think it's very significant how our students have changed and how preoccupied they are with politics, with ethics. So yes, there is a demand of a reflection on that, but let's not fall into the trap of the overarching designer who knows best what the public good is. I would probably, speaking of ethics, insist on also how we design. I think we need to invent more collective mode of design, and I think that's one of the big questions at stake. The environmental crisis is so complex that we cannot continue to design isolated objects. We have to design, very complex set of action and retroaction, and we need to design more collectively. I think that's also a question for education, and that has also to do with ethics.
I wonder, at this moment, the question that we've actually had a lot of graduate school architecture graduate theses that are looking very closely at this question of repair and understanding that breakdown and dissolution might in fact be where there's possibility for invention rather than simply building new and more. So I think that that's an interesting question because it also relates to this question of ethics that I think you raise. And we are in a moment where, let's say, when we look at existing building stock and we're thinking about how to renovate it and or to conserve it from a historic preservation perspective, all of this mid-century modern housing stock, we are at a moment, David Fixler had mentioned in one of his classes that I had attended that we are at a moment where sustainability has taken the moral high ground from the conservationists or the historic conservationists. And I thought that was a very interesting comment because in fact we are dealing with that even in our building today when we're looking at how to manage the question of our glazing system in our building and what we decide is faithful to the aesthetic and design intent of the building, but then how do we actually improve it to meet really true demands that the environment is calling upon us, calling us to act. So I think there's a very, to me, there is a very interesting moment where these conversations are much more alive, but I am really very invested in the question of how we think about or have a strong appreciation for the fragility of the world, and that we might understand that tinkering and working with existing building stock and those issues are actually can be very inventive, and we don't have to think small about them, but that's actually a site for a great amount of invention.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think there's also like a thing which the curriculum of Serge Chermayoff really brings up, which is this question of what's the core and what's the edge of our disciplines. And here we have several disciplines of the built environment, but they tend to sometimes they operate like this. They don't always operate like that. Sometimes they do, but sometimes not. And I wonder if, both your comments and Antoine's also call for this question about where boundaries lie and how hard and fast the edges of the disciplines are and how we might begin to. I mean, we talk about multidisciplinarity and collaboration all the time, but it just hasn't stuck. And I don't know exactly how we get over that, but it comes up for me quite a bit. I wonder at this moment, we have faculty who have done research and have researched in the exhibition and some who are related and collaborators. I wonder if you all have thoughts or before we open it up to the audience, if we missed anything that you should add. No, nothing. We got it. All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and open it up? I mean, there's a fair amount on the table and an incredible amount of work between the two exhibitions.
Hey, thank you so much for this really insightful discussion. I'm an urban planner, and one thing that really stood out to me about this presentation is the dolphin embassy, right? It's just so comical, it's tongue-in-cheek, but it also raises that critique of this discomfort with our relationship with nature. And this is pre-coining of the term Anthropocene. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on what the next paradigm is, right? Like what is going to be the taproot that helps us shift beyond the Anthropocene, and what role do design professionals and those of us who work in the built environment sphere, what are the implications for us in the work that we do?
Big question. I have some personal opinions about this. So the exhibition, I didn't really talk about it, but the exhibition is broken into 3 themes. One of them is called Continuously Becoming Design, which is this idea of design as continuously changing in relationship to increasing amounts of data and network systems. One of them is called Degrowth and Regrowth, and that refers to response to the economic paradigm of late capitalism and a question about whether and how much we should build at all, or whether we should be shifting to a mode of operation that's about gap filling and rebalancing, and thinking differently about what it means to design the built environment through processes. And the third is this question of methods, standards, and protocols. And there's incredible work, particularly in the urban planning department, and in the landscape and architecture. I mean, everyone's doing it actually, but what I'm thinking of here is some work by Carol Vulgares and Neil Kirkwood and Peter Rowe, Rachel Melcher and others, that's being done on trying to actually design processes to understand and see things, to open it up, and then being able to operate on it, but operating on it by rewiring the like path dependencies and deeply embedded structures that are actually forming the built environment. So the things that we can't see, the invisible stuff, seems like it needs to be rewired. So that I'm seeing that both through the work, but I think I also hold it as an opportunity and hope.
I don't know. I mean, I would think, I guess responding from a kind of museum point of view, the idea that, we think about in terms of like how museums work, the 19th century or the 20th century model is that the museum is a place where we produce knowledge and we provide knowledge, and then people come and learn from there. The new model is that the information goes both ways. So it's a place that allows for multiple perspectives, that incorporates the different perspectives and allows to collectively and individually inscribe meaning onto these various perspectives. So I would say, so in that sense, the next paradigm is not something that would be defined by me, but it would be defined by you, for example. So what do you see the next paradigm to be, and how would you enact upon that? But if I were to think about architecture and how what I observe, I see more kind of attending towards perhaps like a more ecological understanding of the role of the architect, and by that I mean that it's always about relationships. It's not about the architect as this thing, the material is that thing, the engineer is that thing, but everyone is co-constitutive of everyone else. That we have to be material scientists, we have to be engineers, we have to be politicians. So I think this kind of loosening up of the definition and of the boundaries of what the role is personally what I see.
I love that way of thinking about it, because as when Elizabeth showed on the screen these categories, natural, human, data, digital, scalable systems, and the other side is artificial, not human, design, cultural, physical, and local, and there was an assumption that the grid is horizontal because these are the poles of this scenario. My sense is that if we actually start to connect these conditions obliquely, so the natural is not human, the scalable system is designed, the data is local, this way, that then we actually start to really begin to reimagine that the possible paradigm shifts that we could have. It was this one.
I think it seems like also on the larger scheme in relation to the environment, in relation to design, and how they are interlinked, it seems like there are two probably major themes that has been basically emerging. One is, rather than what we've been seeing in the 70s and 80s and even 60s, which is the regionalism, looking into the climate in relation to regions, it's more site-specific, right? And that's going to make a lot of difference. And the site-specific conditions are very much dependent on data. And those are basically emerging out of the 90s and the 2000s, where we have advancements in computation where we can see what we cannot see now. And that information becomes very, very useful for designers to be able to build structures that are very much dependent on or in harmony with their own site rather than just the region, right? And being very site-specific. The other one, which is a larger issue, and it's been going on for many years, right? For almost 100 years, rather than the isolation type of thought, which is systems dependent, right? And it has a lot of implications where you have the machine is basically that operates the building, and you're disassociated from your own environment. It's basically connecting the outside to the inside. So rather than machines in terms of technology, it's actually the software. And the software becomes an AI, right, which is data dependent. So there is a softer type of approach, perhaps in the future, where we can be dependent on, or where we can be in harmony with nature, but using AI in a different way, right? Where data becomes more informative, and you are closely linked to your environment, and there is a predictability aspects, and there is some sort of a connection there. But they're all going to be, at the end of the day, very much interlinked with the designer's ability to understand the fundamental principles that are linked to the physics / your own conditions, right? Where without it, it's impossible even, it seems to me, it's very difficult to say, to be more precise, to be able to build structures that are very much in harmony, right? So it's a collective approach. It seems to me there are different ways of looking at it. So the technology, it seems to me, one, in summary, possibility of being able to see the invisible, and the other one to use AI in a different way, perhaps, and we might be able to see it hopefully in the future. And this is some of the research that we are trying to accomplish and do here at the GSD.
I have a comment, but I don't know if there were responses to that first.
No.
So. One of the things that I think is striking about the show and the exhibition is this sense that the scope of architecture is hypertrophied to a world or worlds. And the world game is sort of like a very sort of, I think, apt thing to introduce at this point. At the same time, there's a whole range of different interconnected worlds. There's the world of, there's this, maybe to channel Sloterdijk, there's the sociosphere, there's the hydrosphere, the biosphere. All of those things are interconnected in these sort of very imbricated ways, as is shown through the show and an exhibition. But also it gives me a little bit of an anxiety as an architect that in some ways there are these vast systems in which any action produces unintended consequences. I think that's what has kind of led us to where we are today. And so that's a little bit my question is like, at this moment of intensifying complexity and intensifying imbrication between those worlds, how do we think about those unintended consequences as designers? How do we respond to those? How might we preemptively engage them? What's our responsibility actually for those unintended consequences?
I think one, to simply include them in your consideration, So when a designer thinks about, the material, as I was redefining architecture as this entire process that includes resource extraction and so on and so forth, then this is the moment to think about all those things. Who produced the lumber? Who provide the labor? What were the conditions of that? All that is included, should be included. And I think in many ways, I almost feel like the U.S. might be a bit behind. In Netherlands, for example, a lot of these larger questions of how this, let's say, one material, timber, is spreads its tentacles throughout many different systems, that is almost codified in the way how materials have to be looked at in firms now. So it's not LEED certification, but it's some other thing to make sure that no forced labor was used and all that kind of thing. I think to simply enlarge our scope, that's the project. And I see the same thing happening in architecture history too, taking a more kind of history of science approach. There's a paper recently at one of our conferences where a scholar wrote about a house in California. And it started off with talking about the architect and the house and the design, and then it started to focus on the table in the kitchen, and then it was just one large piece of wood, and then it went on to where the wood was harvested, and then the communities that managed that forest, and then it went on for another 15 minutes about the community and the relationship they had with the forest. And so it started off with the house, and it is a paper about the house, but then it went on to the larger kind of context and footprint of that project. That was very inspiring to me to kind of think about our scope in such a large way.
I might answer that a little bit differently. I mean, one thing that's really interesting, Andrew, I just appreciate that question a lot, because you're asking how do you deal with just the expanse of the unintended consequences. And one of the things that I'm very worried about when I think about issues that are arising in my practice, strangely, we are being asked to be incredibly overly predictive right now. We are in this moment where to propose the most minor change, to do unbelievable amounts of analysis, is the aesthetic virtue is being replaced or superseded by the kind of performance-driven criteria. I think we recognize that, but the performance-driven criteria is now so ridiculously, it's at a standard which actually almost feels as if you're killing kind of the invention that is possible. So one of the things that I'm very worried about at this moment is, and especially the metrics by which we're being asked to do this assessment is actually just mind-numbing. And as a result, I can see also designers wanting to run in the other direction. And that's why I think it's so important to figure out ways in which we keep the architectural imagination very much alive and understand the philosophical conditions that we're dealing with and the cultural ones as well as the historical ones, the precedents, to bring it back to that so that we are actually very, we can bring to bear our disciplinary tools, all of them, without that unbelievable burden of the metrics.
I mean, LEED has totally become a path dependency. It's become like a weirdly, like it's embedded these values that maybe we don't even hold anymore. So I think this question of, how the value systems get translated into processes and then how those processes get translated into design. I think it's actually what's being taken on in the exhibition. But I find it overwhelming, personally.
I think to live with that overwhelming and to have that overwhelming sense, almost sublime sense of the scale of what we're dealing with, be part of the creative process might be, the way that I see going forward. Because what's the other option? To just ignore it, right? So that's not a solution.
No, absolutely not. In fact, I think one of the things that Holly's articles have been, that she's been writing about and teaching, is the kind of way of very nuanced approach. they say that in order to manipulate the law, you must know the law. The law school is always saying this. So, and I actually think that all of these tools, I mean, at least for our students, I hope that they're able to really absorb them and be very facile with them, because I do think that there's incredible nuance that needs to be delivered, and things like LEED cannot be the way that we resolve the climate crisis that we have.
Well, not with meaningful design on the other end. But, yeah. Sarah, did you have a question? Oh, Antoine, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, one, it's almost impossible to predict the unpredictable, so we have to live with incertitude, and that will not go. Second, I think that we have to know that we design for something larger than humans. It's not that simple. We design for all kinds of non-humans, etc., and probably starting by this awareness that the client actually has demultiplied, maybe already a good start to avoid some unintended consequences, not all of them, of course. But I think architecture is no longer only for humans. It has actually become much more complicated in the past decades or two.
Thanks so much for the wonderful presentations and the exhibition. Really enjoy all that. So I'm wondering, given our discussion, are we putting enough emphasis on the human element and on the relation between the designs that we produce and the behavior that these designs might generate or might support? I'm wondering if we are forgetting there's that. I'm wondering, because, and I think the title Artificial Nature implies that we're going to be in a new condition, which I agree with, and that condition will somehow change our minds, probably, and make us perceive things in a different way, maybe somehow change our behavior, our values. So I think we sort of need to understand maybe a little bit more at all the levels, all the scales of the work, from the urban to the building to the component, how that work that we're doing, what kind of influence it will have on our behavior, which is at the root cause of why we have a large problem, right? So I think that connection, I think we need to maybe think a little bit more about, but I'd love to hear what the panelists have to, well, any reflections you have on that.
Well, yeah, so we were talking in class the other day in the design engineering studio about this question of the artificial and who we design for, and is it true that no matter what we do, we're always designing for humans? And I actually think we are. I think even as we're incorporating these larger ideas of non-humans, machine and biological, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know how we get away from human meaning being at the base of what we're doing. It's why we're doing everything that we're doing, and I think it's incredibly hard to escape that. So I don't want to be reductive about that, but I also don't want to let go of the idea that we're making something beautiful and meaningful for human culture.
I think it's probably also a shift in the way we understand the human. So we used to understand the human as separated, and now we understand the human as something that bridges between humanity and non-human. Latour, in Have We Ever Been Modern? We've Never Been Modern, wrote eloquently on this idea that actually the human is a bridge, actually, between the natural and the artificial, or something like that. So I think with the natural and the artificial, we're at the core of the question, because that's actually where the human lies.
Antoine, I think those are going to be our last words, and I think those were excellent last words, because Antoine also introduced during the, I had some conversations with Antoine, and he introduced the idea of this sort of new sublime as our context, and I cannot get over that. You know, this idea that we're now operating in this moment where we're so overwhelmed by the amount of waste and pressure, like Andrew was talking about, that we're perceiving and relating to our environment in entirely new different ways. And I think there's actually an incredible optimism in that. So so thank you so much, Antoine, and to Grace and Carson, certainly Ali, and to all of the faculty, and to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you.